Okay, good morning. We are in Ezekiel part 1, lesson 10b. This is the very last two chapters of Ezekiel part 1 of this precept course. And after this, we're going to have a little bit of a break because of some timing things. But do you want to explain that to anyone? No, you've already got it covered. So we're off how many weeks from this point?
We start back up on the 15th now.
Okay.
We'll start first part of Ezekiel part 2 will be on the 15th.
Okay, we start April 15th for Ezekiel part 2. And just jump right in where you left off and pick up with that lesson. And if you're freshly joining us, just buy that curriculum and get started on that homework. And don't let it overwhelm you if you weren't with us in part 1. Part 2 is really can stand alone because it's going to have a unique segment division of its own that's going to really hone in on a completely distinctive different timeline. So although this would have been beneficial, it's not essential. You can do part 2 and still do fine. All right, so with that said, we have been covering Ezekiel. I want to do a very quick just questionnaire here. Tell me, what do you feel like you have drawn out of your study in Ezekiel so far? What have been the truth lessons or just insights, things that intrigued you and you have felt like you've learned something? I hope a lot. Come on.
For me, one of the things is that, I know that when God says something is going to happen. Well, now I really know it.
Yeah, right.
It's really in there.
It is really in there. God says it, He will do it, and He. Okay, excellent point. So the sovereignty of God.
To piggyback on that is that He doesn't just say it once either.
Right.
Like it is repeated and repeated and repeated in many different ways and forms. So
Yeah. Right.
The message is surely given.
So how do you think people then in our current era in history, in the New Testament era, how is it that we come away from the Old Testament thinking God is simply a God of wrath? If He keeps telling us over and over, and if He tells us these things and then He does it, there's some absolute assurity in that. It's like a parent that's parenting a child. If you do that one more time, you're going to be grounded, and then you don't ground them or you don't follow through, you get insecure as a child. So with our Heavenly Father, He gives us warning, warning, warning. He even tells him it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, and then He does it. So that should give us confidence in God. And to me, that's a God that's fair. That shouldn't cause me to have fear or to think He's wrathful, but rather He was patient. And the idea that He tells us over and over and over, again, tells me that He wants the right outcome. He doesn't want the wrong outcome for His people. Okay.
But on the other side of it is, I was reading where Jesus was saying that you killed the prophets before me. They did.
Mm-hmm.
God sent all these prophets. He sent the Old Testament and tried every angle that He could through many different men.
Mm-hmm.
And Israel rejected every single
Yeah. And not only Israel, but are you learning something about the nations now too?
Nations too. Yes,
The nation, because what are you learning about the idea, since we're into this part now where this last, whatever, how many chapters, was it 6 or something, where we've been looking at, or 8 now maybe, where we're seeing the judgment of the nations, it's those nations surrounding Israel. If God is judging them also, then what do we know as an absolute fact? What do they know about Yahweh?
He's God. Yeah.
They know of Him, don't they? I mean, I think of knowing that, for instance, Daniel being up in Babylon and he's gone before Nebuchadnezzar, and eventually we know Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4, it shows us Nebuchadnezzar at the end of that, his heart turns to God. He exalts God Most High and he acknowledges Him as King of Kings, the one who raises kings up and puts kings down. So what have we been seeing about these kings of Tyre, of Moab, of Ammon, and Edom, and all these ones that we've looked at so far, Tyre in particular, but now Egypt? What do we see about who they seem to think is God? Themselves. And so what do you think about God's approach then with them? I mean, do you feel like God has presented Himself to these nations?
Yes, and they're accountable
Yeah, I think we miss that. I really think in the New Testament we're like, well, how would they know? And that's not fair because he did, he was Israel's God. He wasn't their God. He wasn't exclusive. As a matter of fact, the whole point to God creating the nation of Israel was to do what with them?
Go to the nations.
To make them a light to the world so that when the world was looking around, and they were looking around, and what we saw from looking at Tyre, there's a lot of international business going on in those days. They're traveling to and fro through these nations. They are exposed. Do you remember when Abraham met Melchizedek, king of God Most High, right, from Jerusalem? That was way back early, before Israel really even became a nation. And yet, what did the people in the land of Canaan know about? They knew about God. So, to me, what I'm seeing a little bit more clearly as I'm going through this is how much people of that day actually did know. They did know. They knew about Yahweh. And the word about Yahweh had gone out into the world through the generations of people who started in that core group, right? First Adam and Eve, then Noah and his sons. And as it went out, these people, those who were of faith, and always there's just a remnant among the many. We know that. But we're the remnant, and are we having an effect in our world? Do you feel like everyone in your world knows that you love Jesus Christ, that he came and died for your sins, this is what you believe, and that you will one day be in heaven with Jesus because by faith you are saved through grace? And if you can say yes to that, and most of us, I really do believe we can say yes, our family understands that about us, then guess what those friends and family have heard? They've heard the gospel, right? To a measure, at least a measure. And if they were the least bit interested, would they not ask? Would they not come to you and say, can I come with you to that Bible study? Can I visit your church? Or would you sit with me and tell me what you know about this subject or that subject? People will ask and will be inquisitive. So I am seeing anyway that what we're seeing here in this segment division about the judgment of the nations is that God is not a secret, even in the days of these ancient writings. He was known to globally. As a matter of fact, one of the statements, I think in one of these verses, it says, the word about what I'm doing with you will be known by people in nations you don't even know about. You've never heard of. And so, in other words, it's really, it is going far and wide. So, that for me was one of the really interesting points about what I'm learning here. Another thing is about just the mercy of God. What are you learning about the mercy of God in this?
He leaves a remnant.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't totally wipe out.
He never totally wipes out. There's always a remnant. Sometimes it seems rather doom and gloom, though, doesn't it? Because they come down to being so few. I think we're, again, living in those kinds of days in America now. I can't speak internationally necessarily, although I would bet many of my foreign nation peoples would agree. The earth is getting dark right now in its at least tolerance of Christianity and Christian views and faith. And in that way, it's getting harder for us. But when you think about God's patience, how is he demonstrating that then in this present age? How many times have I said to you, oh, please come, please come. How about tonight? I'm ready, let's go, right? We're all laughing. Yeah, we're all laughing because we all feel the same way. Those of us who are ready, right? And of course, if you're young and you have young children, you're still kind of holding on to that. I understand that that's totally normal. Does not mean your faith is any less. It just means you're still really invested in your young family. But for most of us, as we grow older, we're able to kind of let go of that. And I have grandchildren, and one day, not too far in the future, probably there will be great-grandchildren. And, I would be sad to not be here for some of that. But, it would be far better. I'm just like Paul. Far better to go and be with the Lord. I'm just so excited to see that. Okay, so those are a few things. And I'm sure there's got to be more. Think on this. I'd really like to, when we come back maybe after our break time, if you had some time to really sit before the Lord, not just doing homework, but now sit down with these you're at a glance chart. Okay, one of the questions she asked us at the end was to go through that at a glance chart and look through that and to get some conclusions about things. I also feel like we should be able to do that and really meditate on what God has demonstrated to us, what He's shown to us spiritually for my personal application. This isn't just about writing ancient history, is it? Why is God look at all these details. This kingdom, and he did this, and he did that, and he went here, and he went. I'm like, who cares, right? But what's the point behind what He's trying to teach us?
He has a plan all along.
It sure seems like there's a plan engaged. And it almost also seems to me like every time a king or kingdom gets in the way of accomplishing that or allowing it to be brought to its fruition, then what does God do? He removes that king. Isn't that interesting to think on it from that perspective? That these kings and kingdoms like Babylon, or before that Egypt, then Assyria, then Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, right? And then Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. So as these kingdoms rose and then had to be put down, the reason they had to be put down was it seemed like they were getting in the way of God's job or His purposes. They were trying to thwart and exalt themselves above, just as the king of Tyre, to exalt himself as Satan did and say, I am God. I'm going to rise myself above the heavens. I'm going to sit on the throne of God. And so this again is displayed for us again here in this Ezekiel 31 and 32 about Egypt. And we began our look on Egypt back in 29, where we see it says prophecy was given against the king of Egypt and against all Egypt. So both the king and its kingdom, right? This was all symbolic imagery. And how was this king of Egypt symbolized for us last week? What was this in 29? A crocodile, right? A great monster that lies in the midst of its rivers. So we did a lot of research about how Pharaoh, actually that name Pharaoh came to mean crocodile. And then actually the Pharaoh specifically was the great sea monster, the river monster, implying great strength and power. But Pharaoh, by definition, can mean a crocodile, and it's also the sun or great house. That title, the sun or great house for Pharaoh, for us today would be like the White House. It's the same title, the White House. Okay, so the sun house or the great house was the White House, and they called that sun house or White House a crocodile because it was great and mighty and powerful. See the imagery in there? Because in their life and living, crocodiles in their lakes and rivers were very strong and powerful. So from that, then it worked its way through history, and pretty soon they began to call the king Pharaoh. Instead of the White House, he is now that crocodile, White House. Okay, so that kind of explains how that worked through history. Then after 29, we went to 30, and what happened in 30? This one was the one that we did last week that took quite a bit of time. What did we see happening with what God was doing in this message?
Basically having the day of the Lord stuff and comparing it kind of like to what the day of Israel was, or Egypt was like, and kind of this back and forth. Day of the Lord, day of Egypt, day of the Lord, day of Egypt.
Isn't that interesting? Was it helpful once you saw that pattern of back and forth? Then you go, oh, now I'm seeing a pattern. At least I'm not going crazy looking at this. Now, what by definition is the day of the Lord? What is a day of the Lord?
God steps in and intervenes.
Any day in history that God intervenes in life here on this planet, on planet Earth. Now, we know God is the sovereign. We know He's omniscient, He's omnipresent, He's all those things. But we're speaking of a day. Now, is a day only one day, 24 hours? No, a day can be a period of time. So that's another thing you've got to understand about that title. A day of the Lord does not mean a day. It can be a period of time, and it can be for extended periods of time sometimes. Sometimes a day of the Lord is short. I think there was one day of the Lord where God stopped the sun so that Israel could win a battle.
Joshua asked for
Yes.
Only,
And it was like how many hours? 18 or something like that. It was so many hours. But he stopped the sun. So that's a day of the Lord where God intervened in history, stopped the sun from setting so they could finish their battle, and then God allowed the sun to set. And well, I won't go there. But anyway, so there's that one day of the Lord. And then other days of the Lord are much more profound, like the flood. Well, that day of the Lord lasted over 100 years, right? Period of time where God was saying it's going to rain. He kept preaching it to him. Then the rains came. Then he was 40 days and 40 nights of rain on the earth. And then it was another year before the waters abated and he came off the ark. So that day of the Lord was quite lengthy also. And so I'm saying that to kind of let you have an idea that days of the Lord have already happened in history. But there's also a day of the Lord that is very heavily taught on in the Word of God called In That Day, the day of the Lord, speaking of a specific time in history which is at the end of the age. And that day of the Lord, what is the result of that day of the Lord? What culminates at the end of that time frame called the tribulation?
All Israel will be saved.
All Israel will be saved. And what's going to happen with the other nations?
They'll be judged.
Yeah, there's going to be judgment. And who is going to have a kingdom that will rule the whole earth? Jesus will. It'll be Jesus' millennial kingdom. All other nations will be under his authority, although there will be nations allowed to linger, which is very interesting. I did some work on that, and if we get time, I have a whole little thing about the nations here that I could go through with you, just talking about how God does that, because I think that's a little complicated. I even heard something in a sermon recently that also talked about that a day is going to come when you won't have opportunity to receive salvation, that it's going to be, Jesus is going to come and it's going to be done. Well, for those of us who've done Revelation, what do we know happens during the 1,000-year reign? Do people get saved during the 1,000-year reign? Yes. So, yes, he's right in that moment, everyone who hasn't come into faith, there's going to come a moment of judgment. But then God's going to put us back on the earth. There's going to be some who go on into that millennial kingdom in physical bodies. They're going to be bearing children, and nations are going to be born. Because at the end of that, there is a war that comes. It says it's the number of the sand on the seashore of people that will come against Jerusalem on that day called Gog and Magog. That's at the end of the 1,000 years. But that's when it is done. That's when it's really done.
That's not Gog and Magog.
That's called the day of Gog and Magog, and it's in Revelation 20.
The end of the millennium?
Yes, Gog and Magog.
after
Yeah.
release Satan, and then they also.
It's not,
found out that they-
Armageddon is in the days of tribulation.
Okay, okay.
Gog and Magog is at the end of the 1,000 years. I know. Everybody gets it confused. And the other reason is because the idea of Gog and Magog that's a term about geographical locations on the earth. They keep rising up.
Yeah.
They keep coming back and being ugly. But there is a specific war that happens right at the end. And that war is brief. Boom, it's over.
Yeah, they just-
God rains
enough
down
time-
fire.
Enough time for them to surround the temple, and then boop, fire,
Yeah,
and
fire, and that's it, they're done.
We're not messing with
But the
Satan.
cool thing is if you start to understand what I call dispensations, I have not called them that, somebody else much smarter than me did, but these dispensations in history, when you get to the part where the day of the Lord that mostly is being spoken about here in these Ezekiel passages, when it speaks of a future thing, and when it speaks of that future thing, and it says that, and then they will know that I am the Lord, okay? Ultimately they will know, because right now what we're seeing is God judging some of these nations on the earth that we are familiar with today, places like Egypt and Assyria and Edom and Babylon, and they're on the earth yet today. They're not the nations they were, so God did do what he said in taking their power down, but they're still there, and they're going to raise their ugly head. Do you guys remember what happens in Revelation 17 and 18? Babylon will be finally and ultimately be destroyed. So sometimes when the scriptures here are talking about Babylon and in that day, it may be speaking about that day at the end, called the day of the Lord at the end of the age, when God is going to take care of Babylon. He took care of Babylon, and he is going to take care of Babylon. So now what we have come to see through having this particular subject come up is that you have to be very discerning and careful to identify which day of the Lord God's speaking of when you come across it. And when he says in that day, you have to say which in that day. And literally you need to make yourself a timeline and try to picture where is he speaking of, without forgetting that God did do a judgment of Babylon in ancient days, but he's also going to do a judgment of Babylon at the end of the age. So which one is he speaking of? And that sometimes is hard. This is where Isaiah becomes complicated also. And I've now decided Ezekiel is a wannabe Isaiah, because he kind of does this in this segment here, where he makes statements, and sometimes it is talking about in that moment of history and time that has already occurred back in ancient history, but it's also alluding to things that are going to happen at the end of the age when it will come to its full fruition. There's a partial fulfillment of what God is saying in the day when he takes care of Egypt and all. Tyre, though, Tyre's gone. There's a new Tyre, but the old Tyre, it's gone, right? But Babylon, it's not gone, right? It was destroyed as a powerhouse. Assyria destroyed as a powerhouse. They're in the world yet, and they have some power, but limited. So we have to try to really parse through and say, what do I know about that time, and what do I know about this time? And then we have to say, which one is he speaking of, or is he really speaking of both? When he speaks of it in the old, he means to this degree he's going to handle this. And he's going to handle putting them down, because he doesn't want these nations to thwart his plan of salvation. Right? The ultimate goal is to take us to the King of Kings being ruler over us, and eventually into the new heaven and new earth where there will be no other king. And so we have to know when that time is being spoken of, and then when he's speaking of things that are going to happen in the future. So both things are true. And it's a little dicey in figuring it all out. If you didn't notice that, you have that same problem here. Okay, so we're ready to go into 31 then. Tell me what we saw for keywords in 31. What are your places?
Loftiness, exalted, very high, top, height, greatness.
Ooh, yeah, those were good words. What did those all kind of make you think of? If you had to give it a there you go, pride. That if you just wrote pride and then any other thing that describes pride, very good. So pride becomes a major subject in chapter 31.
The pit and Sheol.
Okay, the pit and Sheol in 31, and we see this in that, yeah, starting
15.
specifically, yeah, but yeah, 10 through 14 kind of sets us up, talking about them going down or taking it down, and how it's going to be fallen in death. And then after that, it enters into 15 and begins to speak about that place. I closed the deep over it. They will go down to Sheol, down to the pit, in the earth beneath, and then again Sheol. So, and how do you see this relating then to what's going to happen in 32? Does this seem like a pattern that's set right here? What you just showed us, Kristen, is that a pattern that's already being established then? Oh, okay. Oh, whoops. Okay. Did anybody else get 32 done?
Yeah. Well, so it's when it's a lamentation for Pharaoh, so he's put down.
Yeah, okay. So all of 30, the first part of 32, how did you break 32 down? 1 through what, and then where? Where's your next part?
Through 8.
Okay,
is what I
okay.
did,
Mm-hmm.
and then I did 9 and 10.
Mm-hmm. Is there a segment division, a major segment division, though, where you see a major change in subject matter? Yes, okay. So 1 through 16 covers stuff that seems to be happening, it says, in the days of Pharaoh of Egypt, right?
Right.
And what's going to happen to him? You just said he's going to go where?
He's going to be put down.
Be put down.
Yeah.
And what does that mean, put down? What kind of put down?
Desolation.
His power put down?
Talks about desolation.
But he also says, I'm going to cast you on the open field. I'm going to make the land drink the discharge of your blood. What kind of down are we talking? Death. Physical death. Okay, so I just wanted you to catch that. Physical death. So he's talking first about a physical death being taken down, which of course brings down the power too. But then you get into verse 17 on, you start with a reference that's given you for time in the beginning of 17. But then from 18 on the end, what is your major key subject again? The one that Kristen brought up.
The nations.
The pit and Sheol. Yeah. Did you all catch it?
Oh, okay.
Did you? Okay, so the first one's talking about physical death. What's the second part talking about? Spiritual death. I hope you caught that. If not, that was really important because that's exactly where the pattern is set back in 31. In 31, he starts talking about Egypt is going to be brought down. It's talking about his physical death. And I'm going to bring him, and he's going to be fallen. He's going to be, and he said, all the birds of the heaven will dwell on the birds of the field, will be on its fallen branches, so that all the trees of the water may not be exalted by their stature. He goes on. He talks about physically dying and physically the nation going down. Then he goes into 15 to 17 and talks about Sheol and the pit again. So there's a little, it's almost like a mini glimpse of the next chapter is held out there to you in this first chapter in 31. So two subject matters then come up in chapter 31. The pit or Sheol, right? And things that pertain to death, right? Anything that talks about death and the fallen and going down in ruin. And you can, and there are qualifiers that kind of accompany that. Things like you will be put on the field, in the open fields, your blood, all those things get brought up, right? Okay. All right, so the major subject matters are Assyria, Egypt, and Babylon. Those are your major geographical locations, right? Any others? Did you say?
Lebanon is in there.
Oh, okay, Lebanon. And what is Lebanon then also part of? That one was a little trickier.
Not there in Assyria, though. That's where
Well,
the cedars are coming from.
The cedars of Lebanon, right. But you know what's really interesting to me? Lebanon was supposed to be Israel's. They just never conquered it and took possession of it.
Oh, is that one of the ones that-
Yeah. So in a way, Lebanon could be talking about Israel, but it really was Israel's unconquered land that she never took.
Okay.
So, yeah. Okay. We see an analogy going on in here. This one was really fun. I actually got some really cool clip art on this. What are the analogies given to us here?
Well, that Assyria was this great cedar.
Okay, have we seen that before? About a cedar tree being as a picture? Yes. Okay, so this is not a new simile or imagery for us. This picture is very familiar. We saw a cedar, the top of it was cut off and planted and all these different things previously. So here we see Assyria compared to a cedar of Lebanon, right? And then we have Egypt. I don't know if anybody knows, but what is a picture in Egypt that you often see? What tree do you often see with the Egyptian pyramids? Palm trees, yeah. So I got a palm tree in there just because I thought that helped me. If God's got trees for all of them, palm trees must be Egyptian. And Babylon, there are the cedars of also in Babylon, but do you know what tree is often referred to as identified with Babylon? The willow. They have a great willow. And I didn't know that, and I found it on my clip art, and I went, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to have to go do a little more research on that just to clarify. But those were the three pictures I gave myself. I put the cedar of Lebanon, the Babylon willow, and the Egyptian palm, so that I would see these are three nations represented by three different kinds of trees, and that helped me see the imagery in this. Where he's talking about all the trees of the field in verse 5, right? So now what has he expounded on? He went from Assyria into Egypt and Babylon.
All the other nations.
All these other nations are now being at least brought into the picture. Are you seeing that? So you could put on the very end of verse 4, and he sent all its channels to all the trees of the field. You could write the word nations on the top of that.
Mark it as my nations.
Okay, that works.
That's what they are. Even if it's
It
not.
is, even if it doesn't say it. You're right. The imagery is that it's nations, yes. And I just drew my trees and wrote nations on top. So that works. Okay.
Okay, so I know you're going to get to this, but he's talking to Pharaoh of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you Assyria.
Yes. Okay. So here, this is great setup. Let's go into this then. So he asks Egypt this question, right? Who is Egypt like? Correct? Whom are you like in your greatness? And what do you think he's actually, what is the implied questions in that by what you've read that follow that? Yeah. I'm much meaner than you. You're so sweet. See, I would say, Egypt, just who do you think you are?
That's what I got.
Just who do you think you are? Do you think you're better than Assyria? And then he goes on to explain how marvelous Assyria was in comparison to Egypt.
Well, and then it also got haughty, and then it got taken down.
Yes,
So, do you want to be Assyria?
All
That's
right.
where you are.
So what we now know then is what God is doing. He's posing a question to Egypt because he's about to handle Egypt. And to some degree, he has been handling Egypt through the ages, as a matter of fact. I don't know why Egypt hasn't learned it yet. But at this point in history, Egypt had rose its ugly head back up again and thought, what could it do for Israel? What was it going to do for Israel? Yeah, thought, okay, here came Babylon. Oh, Egypt, please come help us. Again, Israel relying back on Egypt. Oh, can't we just go back there? At least we had food and water, right? They grumbled and mumbled in the wilderness, and they wanted to go back. God said, you don't go back. You don't lean on them. You don't trust in them. You don't go to them for your resources. You don't marry with them. You are a distinct people. You are my people. I will care for you. But Israel was not learning that. Egypt apparently hadn't learned it either, even though God had done all these things to bring Israel out of their midst and done these mighty wonders, including killing many of their firstborn. Yet Egypt, at this point in history, its time has passed, but now they're raising their head up and going, we're mighty, we have big britches, right? That's kind of what's going on here. Egypt thinks that they've got big britches and that they can be who they want to be in the world and that they can come back. And they think they're going to go up against Babylon. Whew. But who has empowered Babylon? God has. Can you go against God and win? No. Okay, so let's start with the title on our theme then. So we kind of know the main thing going on here is about Egypt and Assyria. And what is your title on that? How did you encompass or incorporate both Assyria and Egypt into a title? Oh, okay, that worked. Okay, because what you're doing is it's not really a contrast, but you're making a comparison of one with the other, because that's what God is doing here, making a comparison, okay?
Like Assyria, Pharaoh's height cut down.
Okay, that'll work. Like Assyria?
Like Assyria,
Yeah.
it's just going down to the pit.
Egypt will be brought down. Okay, so that's a really good title. That works very nicely. I had used that little phrase in there, so also, where he says, so also will you at the I think it's at the end. Yeah. Yet you will be brought down to Eden beneath the earth. So is Pharaoh and all his hordes, he says in verse 18. So is Pharaoh. So just as Egypt was, so is Pharaoh. Okay, or as Assyria was, so is Egypt. So this works really nicely though. Like Assyria, because that's kind of in English. Like Assyria, Egypt will be brought down. So my question in 1 and 2 starts out here. 1 and 2. We see concerning Egypt, who is Egypt like? And that's God. God's question, who do they think they are? That's kind of in parentheses. Do they think they're stronger than Assyria is really what God's going to ask them? I'm going to explain to you who Assyria was. And do you think you're stronger than that? Do you have superior glory than she? He's going to talk all about her glory in here, how beautiful she was, how strong. And then do they think they can thwart God's plan of judgment when Assyria did not? if Assyria did not, does Egypt think that they cannot, especially at this point in history, they aren't quite at that grandiose power level that they were at in ancient history. Here it is generations later, and now they're raising up their head again and trying to be king of the mountain again. They want to come back on the scene and rise up again and take power again. And God is slapping them back down, right? Okay, so that's 1 and 2 sets it up. Who is Egypt like? So that's what God's question is. It's a little bit like Tyre, where we saw the king of Tyre being Satan, and then we talked about the leader of Tyre, who was the king of Tyre, and how God makes this comparison about the arrogance of these leaders to one another. Again, I think this whole thing is all about arrogance. It's about their arrogance. Arrogance or pride. It seems to be the subject matter here, right? Okay, so 3 and 4 then, what does God then go on to do? He goes on to explain, I'm breaking it really short ones, but this is going to go quick. 3 and 4, what did God tell him about Assyria? It was a cedar in Lebanon.
Beautiful and spread wide.
Mm-hmm.
It was
Very high.
very high.
Mm-hmm. Its top was among the clouds. It's just talking about the greatness of it. The waters made it grow. The deep made it high with its rivers. It continually extended all around its planting. What does that mean? It extended all around its planting. It kept growing. So not only was it great and mighty and this big, beautiful thing, it was big and beautiful, and it grew. Big and beautiful and grew. So Assyria, beautiful, and grew beyond its planting. So it began something small, and then it just kept growing bigger and bigger. And is that not actually the case with all of these nations we've seen? Even Israel started out with one man, right, with a barren wife, with Abraham, and through the generations it gradually grew. So Assyria is one of those also. It started smaller, and it grew, and it became mighty. And then what do we see then in 5 and 6 about it? Yeah, so what is it telling you there?
All great nations lived under its shade.
Okay, all great nations. Not little nations, great nations lived under its shade. Does this sound familiar to a previous study we've done? Was there another person who was like a great tree and all the birds of the air came and nested in it? Nebuchadnezzar. Same. And what's interesting to me about that imagery being so similar is Daniel just wrote this. I mean, he's a peer to Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and writing these things at about the same time. And so while Ezekiel's having these visions and God is explaining this to those by the river Chebar, up in Babylon, in the major city there where the king is, Daniel is interpreting dreams that God is sending to Nebuchadnezzar, telling him, you are a great tree. Okay, so here he's saying about God is viewing Assyria in that same way. You're a great tree, and all the nations are living under your shade. Okay, 7 to 9. No. It was so beautiful in the length of its branches. The cedars in God's garden could not match it. Now, what is that speaking about, God's garden? Yes. How about, I actually ended up double underlining this and marking it as a key repeated statement in a variety of ways. Back up to verse 5, where it says, therefore its height was loftier than all the trees of the field. So I underlined that in a certain color. And I drew a line down to verse 8, the cedars in God's garden, because this is talking about on the earth, right? Then I went down from there to, I also missed one in verse 6. all great nations lived under it. Again, the trees of the field and all the great nations. Then in verse 8, the cedars in God's garden is the same reference. And then at the very end, 9, all the trees of Eden. So he makes a repeated statement 4 times about this analogy of trees in groups of I guess, in other words, they're not being identified or singled out, but they're groups of kingdoms that are being mentioned and being personified as trees of the field, cedars in God's garden. No tree in God's garden can compare with it. There it is again. I missed one in verse 8. And then he says, all the trees of Eden, which were in the garden of God, were jealous of it. So the garden of God in this analogy is where? All of creation. On this earth. I drew a globe on it and just drew a picture of the earth. So all over my page here, I've got the field, the garden, Eden, and the garden of God, all marked with a little globe that looks like the earth to me, so that I would recognize. So he's talking about on the earth. That helps you, especially when you start talking about the Garden of Eden. People go to two places, either the Garden of Eden in the days of Adam and Eve, or they go to the Garden of Eden, which is in heaven. The Garden of Eden, because there's a garden. Remember what we learned about the king of Tyre, who was Satan. He walked in the midst of the garden of stones in the Garden of Eden, right? And that was talking about the heavenly garden. So again, God has a true place, and he has a picture of it here on the earth for us to see. We get a shadow of what in the glory there really is in reality. All right, so in 7 to 9 then, when he's seeing all these great nations in 5 and 6 lived under its shade, in 7 to 9, who does it say is the author of all this? Yeah. So do you think that's a point he's trying to make here? Yeah, good. God made it beautiful. So all Assyria, it was beautiful, but God made it beautiful. See? All the trees were jealous of it. And then in 10 to 14, there's almost a button here. I don't know if it actually is a but. 10 to 14. Let's go on to 10. Therefore is in there. And he also says because, right? So what is the because and what is the therefore saying to us? What happens in 10 to 14?
Basically, even though I made it beautiful and it was great, it tried to take credit for it. It was prideful, and so then I brought it down.
Yeah. And he literally says in 10, and its heart is haughty in its loftiness. So just like the king of Tyre, just like the leader of Tyre also, we see that the beauty, the power, the position, the grandeur of his life and of all that he was given power and possession over, that went to his head. And all of a sudden he took credit that, look at me, look what I have done. This is what Nebuchadnezzar did, stood on the top of his kingdom, the palace, and he says, look at this place that I have created by myself. Who was it earlier in the alligator imagery? He says, my Nile, which I created. Here it is again, Assyria. What did Assyria do? His heart was haughty, right? About all that he had because of his loftiness. And what did God do?
Cut it down. Give it over to the nations.
Assyria's heart was lofty, or was haughty, it says. And God cut it down. So right now, at this point, then what we can see without any difficulty at all, it seems like there is always this cause and effect. The cause is when you men become prideful, and in particular, you men who lead the nations of the earth, which I have given you that power and position. You don't understand what a treasure, what a blessing, what a gift it is for me to entrust to you my nations. These are my nations, and this is where these kings of the earth are missing. They've had exposure to God Most High. They know God Most High according to the teachings that they would have heard through the Jews in particular, but even before that in history, God was known. And they are rejecting that it's God that does it and that God is the one who gives these gifts. And so they take the gifts that they have given them, their beauty, their position, their power, their talents, their resources, all the things that they have, and they think that they did it all. It was all of their own doing. So this is what God is showing to Egypt. Who is Egypt like? Who do they think they are? And he talks about their arrogance and their pride. He says, well, let me give you an object lesson here. Object lesson is Assyria. Assyria was beautiful. It grew beyond its planting. All great nations lived under its shade. But it was God who made it beautiful. And all the trees were jealous of it. I did that for them. Well, guess what? The Assyrians who were haughty, God cut them down. And 15 to 17 then. First he cut it down, which is the subject of death, right? There's my little tomb. 15 to 17, what did God do?
Made the nations quake at the sound of its fall.
Well, they went down to Sheol.
Yeah, he made Assyria go down to Sheol. But yes, both are true. All of that's involved. This first paragraph, though, 10 to 12, talks about the physical death going down. Now we're moving into the spiritual death, where God made Assyria go down to Sheol. And I'm going to write this on here in a bright color so you can. So this is physical death, and then this is spiritual death. Just so you catch that, you might want to write that in a bright color on your observation worksheet so that you see the distinction in these two paragraphs here, how he brought this down. So once he does that with her, then he goes back to who as in this closing verse? In 18, who does he go back to readdress? Uh-huh. He returned. Yeah, he's not talking about Assyria anymore. Now he's saying, to which among the trees of Eden are you, Egypt, thus equal in glory and greatness? Yet you will be brought down with the trees of Eden to the earth beneath. You will lie in the midst of the uncircumcised with those who were slain by the sword. So that's a physical death. So is Pharaoh and all his hordes, declares the Lord God. So he's saying about Pharaoh, you are also going to go down. I am going to bring a death to you and your nation. Because up here who do you think you are, right? Mr. Smarty Pants.
Katie, can I ask a question
Mm-hmm.
about the earth beneath?
Okay, hold on a second.
Okay.
Declares the Lord. Just going to put that on there and I wanted to close with another point. Go ahead.
He uses the phrase like the earth beneath. After he talks about them going down in the, okay, so starting at like 16, it's for those that go down to the pit. And all the well-watered trees of Eden were comforted in the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you go to 18, it's a similar situation.
Mm-hmm.
You will be brought down with the trees of Eden to the earth beneath.
Okay, so it's almost like he's hitting on both subjects there, isn't it?
So, well, what is supposed to be the earth beneath? Is it symbolic of something, or is he
Okay.
talking about it because the earth is beneath? It's also me, like I'm up here, and so the earth beneath, like
Okay, verse 20.
14.
yeah, like there's just this earth.
Okay. Well-watered death to the earth beneath among the sons of men who go down to the what? Pit. So the earth beneath and the pit are
Is it
Sheol.
okay? So is it
Yeah.
okay.
So he's actually addressing both. He's saying you will both physically die and you will spiritually die. And he's making that, you're right, it's a good point. I didn't even put it on my observation
So
sheets there.
we should probably mark earth beneath that as the same.
Earth beneath as a pit. And yes, I know you can. And the reason I can't, if you go into 32, he does it again. he calls in 24, he calls it the lower parts of the earth. And he talks about making the, and see in verse 19, you go down and make your bed with the uncircumcised. What has he said over here about Pharaoh? In verse 18, you will lie where? In the midst of the uncircumcised, with those who were slain by the sword. So where are the uncircumcised? When it speaks about the uncircumcised and their death, where do they go? Right. And what is uncircumcised in our English? What would that be? How would we translate that? Unsaved, unbelievers, out of faith, those who are not in faith. So the unbelievers, so in the midst of the unbelievers, with those who were slain by the sword. So first they're killed, and then they go to this place called beneath. I got to mark that. I got beneath the earth. Okay, and that's really a good point to make. So over here then, he closes this whole thing out talking about they will by the sword, number one, and they will go to midst of uncircumcised. Did you catch that? So by the sword, you've got physical death, and this is spiritual death. Wow. Nice. That wraps it up very nicely, doesn't it? Do you see it? So he lays it out in 2 paragraphs, and then he culminates it in one little sentence all about Pharaoh. Gives him both judgments. There's a dual judgment. So that ends 31. How do you like that? It's only 10 o'clock. We're done with one chapter. Any questions about chapter 31 at this point?
So the comfort part, and I think it's in 32 as well. What is that comfort?
I marked it,
It's in
but
verse 16, and all the well-watered trees of Eden, the choicest and best of Lebanon, were comforted.
I'm sorry, give me the chapter and verse.
It's chapter 31:16.
31:16, okay. Well, water trees of being choices were comforted in the earth beneath. Okay, well.
It's down in Sheol, and Abraham was there.
Thank you, very good. Oh, I'm
Okay,
so here we have. So I have a whole teaching on this.
We're going there.
Since we're going there. And I almost wonder if I have time to do this, but I almost have to, because in order to lay out enough understanding so you go into 32 in your head, you can make these adjustments in your head as to what's being talked about. We almost have to go back to that. If you go back to Luke, let's see here. I have this whole subject study on the subject of Sheol and the pit. Let's see, where is it? Here it is.
Okay, so
Nope, that's not it.
Before you get to that, I thought what this was saying is they were both going to hell, not going into 2 different places.
They are both going into Sheol. And
Which is
Sheol
2 places.
Sheol has 2 compartments.
And so the best of Lebanon is going to paradise.
Apparently. It's
Okay.
because if it's called comfort, then you can be assured that's what it is.
Okay.
The place of comfort in Sheol. And then there's the,
Yeah.
yes.
She also called Abraham's bosom.
Also called Abraham. See, you guys already know a lot of this. And a lot of you guys do know this. Go ahead.
Then the uncircumcised in 18 are the unbelievers, so that is,
That's the other side of
That's-
Sheol.
And that's the other side.
yes.
Yes. So that's what's really cool about the subject of Sheol, that you have to know. You have to understand Sheol has 2 compartments. So when Scripture, because when I went through and I pulled out a bunch of verses, this is what got me running late today. But people like David and Jacob and, I mean, all these Old Testament prophets, they speak about going into Sheol at their death. And Jesus, where did Jesus go? To the belly of the earth, the place called Sheol. So he was spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. And then when he resurrected, he took with him, it says, a host of captives and set them free. That's Ephesians 4:8. What part of Sheol did he take with him? Abraham's bosom. So just to do a very quick drawing on this for those who've never had this before, this is my pictures. Here's the earth. It's going to be disproportionate, you guys, because I want you to see it.
And there's a big gap.
There's a chasm that's in between them. And then there's, let's see, so there's, this is the chasm between them. It's not proportionate, but that's okay. So here's what I'm going to do for you. This blue part is comfort, the place of comfort, called Abraham's bosom. You're going to find all of this in Luke 16, if you want to go in there and draw it all out for yourself. And I will send you the chart if Kristen will remind me.
Okay.
And I will send you a student help chart that gives you scripture verses that you can follow along. And for those who've been doing this study with Precept for a long time, I've taken you through this many, many times. So it's not like it's not known to you, but let's see.
The blue is, what is blue?
The blue is the bosom of Abraham.
Well, before when you drew it, you always drew it.
I know,
left and right.
side by side.
She's doing it like a sphere.
But I'm doing it in a sphere because the reality is, what's the belly of the earth?
The whole thing.
This is earth,
In the center.
right? This is the earth. At the center of the earth, the belly of the earth, the heart of the earth, Jesus says, 3 days and 3 nights shall I be in the heart of the earth. Okay? This is the heart of the earth. This is the earth. Okay? And he talks about this in Luke 16, he talks about the bosom of Abraham. And then he talks about, and I don't have any red, I'll use pink. It'll be pink flames. This is the place of torment, okay? So here we have the place of torment. Okay, or also called Hades. Can you read that? Place of torment. Up here, this is Abraham's bosom. Okay, place of comfort. That's that passage that you just brought up, the place of comfort. Okay, and so this is the earth. Now, what we have is a timeline we're going to put on here.
Okay, before you do that, Katie, what is the red circle then?
That's the
Pardon?
chasm. That's the chasm that keeps them separate.
Oh, the orange that's on there is the chasm that separates them. Okay, so let me just read this to you real quickly, okay? Because this is going to be helpful. If you go in and do Luke 16, starting in verse 19 through 31, this is the story about the rich man and Lazarus. Okay, Jesus is speaking this. It is not a parable. It's misunderstood in that way. It is not, because names are named, and they're literal people. We know historical figures like Abraham, okay? He says, now there was a rich man. He habitually dressed in purple and fine linen, joyously living in splendor every day. And a poor man named Lazarus was laid at his gate, covered with sores, longing to be fed with the crumbs which were falling from the rich man's table. Besides, even the dogs were coming and licking Lazarus' sores. Now, the poor man died and was carried away by the angels to the bosom of Abraham. So now we're in the blue place, this place of comfort. The rich man also died, and he was buried. In Hades, he lifted up his eyes, being in torment. So that's this place right here, in torment. I also think, though, all of this is called Sheol. The totality of this place is called Sheol. Sometimes it is also called Hades. But here they actually call this Hades. Being in Hades, okay, he says he lifted up his eyes. He saw Abraham far away and Lazarus in his bosom. So Lazarus is in here with Abraham. And he says, and he, the rich man, cried out and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus so that he may dip the tip of his finger into water, and cool off my tongue, for I am in agony in this flame. So what's in here? Flames. Okay? But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your life you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus bad things. But now he is being comforted here, and you are in agony." So that's why it's called the place of comfort and the place of agony. "And besides all this, between us and you there is a great chasm fixed." That's the orange. This fixed chasm. "That none may cross over from there to us." And he said, "Then I beg you, Father, that you send him," Lazarus, "to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, in order that he may be able to warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment." But Abraham said, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them." But he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." Oh boy. Well, we're well beyond the cross and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Does everyone come to faith? No. But he said, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead." Okay, now I want to take you through and just give you a few more pieces of information, because I think it's going to be helpful in the rest of our Ezekiel study. Okay, so we're back here with Ezekiel, just on a timeline, right? From Ezekiel, then we go to the cross, right? We have the hill, the cross. I should have made this one like that, okay? So there's the cross. We have, I'm going to put it way down here. We're waiting for the day of tribulation, which is 7 years. It's followed by the kingdom of Christ during the 1,000-year reign. After the 1,000-year reign, there's going to be what's called a great white throne judgment. Okay, so those are the pieces on the timeline that I'm just laying out as qualifying places. It's obviously out of perspective here, but you can see progressively where they fall. So at the cross, this place existed from time immemorial. When people physically died, they went to this place called the bosom of Abraham. And that was true until Jesus came, right? When Jesus came, he tells us, I'm going to use orange, I think, to mark Jesus as coming and going. Okay, Jesus, he says, "I will be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth." Right? So he goes to the belly of the earth. When he resurrects, he comes before a little girl here with a little pink skirt. Okay? And he says, "Do not touch me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." Do you remember that? He had spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. I'm going to put here 3 days and 3 nights in belly of earth.
And he also told the thief on the cross, "Today you will."
Okay, let's add that in right now. Perfect. "And he said to the thief on the cross, 'Today you shall be with me in paradise.'" Okay, all of these are on this chart here on the side that I'm going to send to you all. Okay, so the references are there, and I even explain what's being said about it slightly. So you can look it up for yourself, and also then you can follow it along. But you can do a timeline like this for yourself, and you can plot all these things in here. But it's awesome once you get these things put in the right place. So you know then that the thief on the cross, he did not go to heaven at his death. He went to the belly of the earth, just as all the Old Testament saints did. Here we have, they go to Hades or Sheol, Isaiah 14, Genesis 37, Psalms 49. There's David, there's Jacob, there's all these people. All the ones that you know are saints and they love God are going to Sheol in the Old Testament. So you know that's not always bad. Has to be good, right? Because they're lovers of God. A man after God's own heart is David. So where did he go? He went to Sheol in the bosom of Abraham, in the place of comfort. Why could they not go directly to be with God in the presence of God at that point in history?
Because Christ's blood hasn't been
That's
paid
right.
yet.
The propitiation for sin had not yet been paid. It had to be first, and Jesus had to be the first fruits of the resurrection, according to Corinthians, right? So what happens is when he resurrects, he says, "Don't touch me, I've not yet ascended to the Father." then what does he do? He ascends to the Father. Okay, so here's my cloud, my little puffy cloud. Jesus goes to the Father, and then what does he do? Same day, he comes back, and he spends 40 days and 40 nights presenting himself alive, right? At the end of 40 days, it says he ascended on high, right? So he's going to, at the end of it, he's going to go up on high. I didn't have to start there. I'll go over here. Because we know we're in the church age still. We have to have some church age left in there. So I'm just going to put that on here. The church is in place. That's where we are in history right now. Okay, so now Jesus ascends on high, and it says, and when he went on high, he set free a host of captives. Now, who would he set free from Sheol? Only the believers. He wouldn't be taking the unbelievers, right? So he takes those from the bosom of Abraham with him, and they ascend on high. You're going to see all this on your chart. Then what happens is, as time goes on, at the end of the age, Jesus is going to have this 1,000-year reign here. We're going to have other things going on. I'm not going to go into all the other details. But what we know concerning Hades and Sheol that we need to know is that at the end of the age, it says the earth is going to give up its dead, and death and Hades will give up its dead. And those who are in her, meaning this place of torment, they are going to go before the great white throne judgment. So here,
Abraham's bosom is empty, and it'll stay empty, correct?
the bosom of Abraham is empty.
And will be empty.
Right, and is always, because, and I didn't do it, but because why? Now when we die, has the propitiation already been made? Yes, because Jesus went up, he made propitiation, he put the blood on the altar, blood on altar. Now he comes back to the earth, and he does his 40 days on the earth presenting himself alive. Now, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. That's also on this list, so you won't miss it. I know you're smiling and going, I know, Katie, I've done this a million times with you. I know. I love to give.
Not with you,
Oh,
I've
you,
seen it in this format.
oh, okay. Well, when I teach it in other times, when it's the whole lesson, I really go into details, and we map it all out, and you get all the verses, you get the whole thing. This is a mini version of this.
There's spirits, though, that are in the place of
It's right now the spirits. Right now, we're still in the church age, and we're waiting for the resurrection. The bodies are still lying dead in the grave, but the spirits are with the Lord.
At the rapture, their bodies.
The bodies will come up and join. Yeah, and that's not on here because I didn't go into the raptures. That was the part I said I'm not going to go there, because the rapture is a whole other thing. But the rapture is of the body. The soul does not sleep. The soul goes to be with the Lord at death. So in the church age, because Christ has come, the propitiation has been made, now absent from the body, present with the Lord. So, but at the end of the age, though, it says there's going to be, death and Hades is going to be thrown into the lake of fire. So that's interesting. So now we have another place called the lake of fire. It's no better than the last place. But what's happening at this point in history is all these people here, they go before God, and then they're brought back down, put into this lake of fire. What's happened previous to this is in here are Satan, the false prophet, and the Antichrist. Fallen angels. Yeah, I wasn't doing all of it, but yes, yes. So what you know is that this place called Hades is not the ultimate lake of fire. That's something separate. It's different. Because what's going to happen at the end of the age when God comes to the end of this 1,000-year reign, the earth is going to be destroyed. 1 Peter covers that for us. And it says that will wax away and wane away, that will be rolled up like a cloud. And all this is going to be gone, and what do we get? We get a new heaven, and a new earth. Yay! That's a very messy heaven and earth there. But that's what we get. We get a new heaven and a new earth. And if that's not sloppy enough for you, I don't know what is. But now that you've been walked through that, as we're talking about Sheol in this next chapter, now your mind is set to say, okay, now I got a good grip on this. If you don't, what I did this morning, which took me some time off, is I Googled Bible verses about Sheol. That's all I want, is the Bible verses. I don't want someone's commentary and all the reading you have to read through. I just wanted the verses. I want to read the verses, and then the ones that I know I am understanding what's being said, I'm going to selectively piece together information. So what I learned about Sheol in red is this thing called the place of torment, which is mostly being talked about right here in these laments. Lament for them. Do you think God would want us to lament if we were going to go to be with the Lord? If they were going to the bosom of Abraham in that day? No, he'd be saying, rejoice, they're going to the bosom of Abraham. But he's saying lament for them. He says about in Ecclesiastes, in Sheol there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. The rich man died and was buried in Hades, being in torment. In Psalms it says, let death seal over them, let them go down to Sheol alive, for evil is in their dwelling place and in their heart. That's why you go. You go there because of evil in your heart. And that's who goes to this place called the belly of the earth of torment. So Hades being in torment. So he clarifies in Luke 16, in Hades being in torment. So Hades, there's two sections, the bosom of Abraham and the place of torment. He's saying in the place of torment of Hades. Okay. 51, let's see, going down here. I found some verses that talks about Jesus has the keys of death and Hades, right? We learned that in Revelation. In 2 Thessalonians it says, and they will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. That tells you what this place of torment is like. It's away from the presence of God and away from his glory. Sheol in Isaiah says, Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. Do you remember something in 32 where he says he was excited or comforted by the fact that others were going to be there with him? Do you remember that at the end of 32? It's like, whoa, misery loves company, right? Okay. And so that's typical for them. Sheol does not thank you. Death does not praise you. Those who go down to the pit do not hope for your faithfulness. So these are people who are unbelievers who have rejected God. And it's also later called, and death and Hades were thrown alive into the lake of fire. That is the second death. So that's Revelation 20, verse 4 right here. When this is thrown into the lake of fire, it's Revelation 20, verse 4. 2014. So in 2 Peter, it refers to this place as God did not spare angels. Here's your angels verse. When they sinned, but he cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment.
So that's because of that verse and a couple others. Like, to me, the lake of fire has always been worse than Hades, the place of torment, because at least there was light at one point.
It seems like there was light, yeah, and they were able to see.
The
And you know what's,
were there.
yeah, the other thing is when you read that Luke 16, you're able to converse from this place to this place. You're able to see back and forth. Can you imagine being in this place of torment and watching the people in the place of comfort? No. Don't go there. Not fun. Okay. Well, all right. So my point is, go in, Google Sheol on your computer, just Sheol, and ask for Bible scriptures or Bible verses on that subject. That way you'll find a link like this one that just gives you lists of scripture verses, and that'll be more concise. I will send you this chart right here, but with no drawing on it. You'll have to do all your own drawing on this. Now, I made myself a list, and we'll talk about this in a minute, from Ezekiel 32 and added it to my chart, and I'm going to go back in and do some adjustments on it because I thought it was really cool. Some of the things that we see here in Ezekiel 32 that actually expound on your understanding of Sheol. Okay, my fingers are getting cramped here. Okay, and okay, so that's Sheol. The description of Hades, I got all that. I did word studies on the netherworld and Sheol. Did you all do that? Did you get it? Okay, the netherworld, which is in 32:18. I'll just, because it all pertains to this. It's called the lower parts. That makes sense, right? Sheol, land without return, or the underworld. It's also called the abode of the dead, the place of no return. It also says without praise of God. So that is speaking of the inner part. The wicked are sent there for punishment. Sheol, the underworld. Hades, the grave. It's also called the grave. That's why sometimes the grave is meaning a spiritual death. Sometimes it means a physical death, and you have to figure it out. The place underneath the earth where the dead reside, the realm of the dead. Okay, so that gives you the netherworld and Sheol definitions, and that lines up with what we just looked at here with Luke 16 as a backdrop. Okay, now we're ready to move forward. And I did last week with you a little bit about the day of the Lord. So I think we're pretty good there, right? Two possibilities for interpretation. There's a day of the Lord that can be a day in current history, but there is the day of the Lord coming, which is the end of the age. That's going to be down here. I'll write that on here so that you understand it. The day of the Lord can be a period of time or otherwise. So if you go here, day of the Lord. And it goes on forever once you start there. Once you hit the tribulation, the day of the Lord, as far as I can tell from Scripture, does not end. Because he's intervening here during the 7 years. He's definitely intervening here because he's living with us. And then after that, we go to the new heaven and new earth. And so the day of the Lord just never ceases from that point forward. Now, there have been days of the Lord in time here. We know there is a day for Egypt that was called in their day, in Egypt's day. And we covered that last week. Okay? All right, now, let's go on to 32. Do we have any questions from the ladies online at this point, or are they all good? Okay. Okay, so we've already discussed that we see chapter 32 breaks down into two major segment divisions. That you can break the paragraphs down, and I did, but if you just got two major segment divisions, it would be sufficient for you to understand the flow of conversation that's going on there. So the first segment starts in verse 1 and goes all the way to verse 16. The second segment starts in 17. Well, 17 is just a transition verse, but it starts in 18 and goes to the end of the chapter. Okay? So on the whole then, what did you title Ezekiel 32? Did you notice you almost had to give it two titles? I did, yeah. Okay, so let's get our theme up here on 32. What were your key words in 32? Lamentation, perfect. And? Okay, lamentation, which is wailing, right? Again, that's a synonym, yes. Yes, the uncircumcised. And again, how did we define what the uncircumcised is referring to? The unbelievers. Anyone who's not a believing person. In that day, why do you think they used that phrase uncircumcised? Who was the letter written to and through? Through a Jewish man to a Jewish people who were under covenant of the law. And the law's sign of the covenant was circumcision. Okay, so because of that, they understood that if you're in covenant with God, which means you have bowed your knee to him and you're being obedient to him, supposed to be, to the best of your ability, and with the allowances of sacrifices and grain offerings for your sin. But anyone who is showing allegiance with God is circumcised. Anyone who is not in allegiance with God is uncircumcised. And according to the law, if you were uncircumcised, what would happen to you? You would be cast out. You would be literally, you could die for other specific sins, but you would be cast out if you were uncircumcised. Okay. So, what is going on then in the first half of this chapter? What is your first theme going to be? First title. If you had to title 1 through 16, what would you call it?
I put Pharaoh caught in the net and extinguished.
Well, that's good. Pharaoh caught in the net and extinguished. Good. I like the idea that you brought up lamentation as a key word. You could use that in your title. Did you do that, Karen?
Yeah, lamentation over Pharaoh.
Okay, there you go.
Verse 2.
See, I do like to use words from the text. Lamentation over Pharaoh. I went ahead and I gave him his qualifier, king of Egypt, because that's our subject is Egypt, right? And then I added in one more word. What might distinguish the first part from the second part in identifying what the major thing that's going on in here subject-wise? What happens in the first segment? What is it? What kind of death is it talking about? Physical death. So I use the word slain because that's what it keeps saying. Okay, so that's physical death.
So would we call 1 through 16 the day of Egypt?
1 to 16. And then, well, this is how I'm breaking it into two titles, not one. I'm giving it two titles because there are two major segments about two subjects. One subject is about the physical destruction or slaying of Egypt and Pharaoh and its people. The second part of it is about what? About what? Spiritual death, right? Because how much of Sheol and the pit and beneath the earth and the netherworld, how much of that is in there as a subject matter? Does it dominate the subject?
Yes.
It's your dominant subject in that last half of the chapter, right? So it has to be your major subject. It needs to be in your title somewhere, right? So concerning that subject about Sheol, let's just call it Sheol, who is it that's going to go down to Sheol in that second part of that? Verses 17 to, what is it, 32? What happens to who? Yeah, the uncircumcised and who else? Okay, so the uncircumcised, which kind of culminates it to being the hordes, right? He's referring to the hordes. Where are you at? And you see that?
18.
So-
Man for the hordes of Egypt.
Okay, the hordes of Egypt. Okay, and who else is going to go down?
Powerful nations.
Mm-hmm. Well, how about if you go to 32? Because it really does give you a nice conclusion verse. Verse 32. Though I instilled a terror of Egypt in the land of the living. So in other words, God did this to you, Egypt. I did for you what I did to Assyria. I raised you up. I made you beautiful. I made you powerful, right? I gave you these things. And I made you a terror in the land of the living. What is the land of the living speaking of? The earth, right? People on the earth. All the people on the earth, anyone that's living, they're afraid of you because Egypt, that's how powerful you were. I instilled a terror of Egypt in the land of the living, yet he will what? Be made to lie down among what? The uncircumcised, along with those slain by the sword, even Pharaoh and all his hordes. Now the hordes, by definition, what is a horde? It can be the nations, warriors, armies, bullies. And in the context of what we've been saying here, we see that word horde all over the place. I will cause your hordes to fall with you. They are tyrants, verse 12. Of them are tyrants of the nations. So hordes is referring to tyrants of the nations. So in other words, other kingdoms also, right? So in the conclusion of this, who is going to go down is Egypt and all her hordes, right? And where are they going to go down to according to the bigger picture of everything that's said? All the uncircumcised, and where are they going to go down to? To the pit or to Sheol, right? You could call that the pit, Sheol, the pit. I think specifically this is the pit. I've never heard that referred to in that way up there, but up here, the pit, and then also what was really interesting is there seems to be degrees of the pit. The deepest parts of the pit that are mentioned at a certain point. Okay, so I'm going to give you the second title here on this would be Egypt, because that's our major subject, Egypt. And this was Pharaoh up here, Egypt, and all her hordes. That's going to be, and all her hordes, I'm just going to put a green flag on that so that you understand that's speaking of all the other nations, right? That either she has influence on or who come to her aid or who along with her are doing the same kind of horrible bullying things. He says, Egypt and all her hordes will go down to Sheol. Okay, that's 17 to 32 on the whole. So those are my two titles. Both of them are kind of lengthy, but they do a really good job, I think, of in totality. If that's all we did, we could be done right now. But now we're ready to go in and talk about each of these two segments. So we'll start with the first segment here, and it's going to be 17 to 21. It starts us out explaining to us about Egypt and who.
Are you starting at 17 or are you starting at 1?
Oh, I'm so sorry. You're right. I went to the wrong column. I know. I have my thumb in the wrong place. 1 and 2. Yeah, you're right. Okay. Lamentation. Okay, let's do this one more time. Lamentation, by definition, is what? A funeral dirge, an elegy, I think they call it. Yeah. What is the purpose of a lamentation? What are you trying to express? Sorrow, right? Or grief, right? It's a mourning song of sorrow and grief. So if there is sorrow involved and grief involved, this is not delighting in the falling down of people, of nations, right? God is sorrowing over this. Again, one more time, he takes about this subject of lamentation. I'm going to put it up here. He tells them to lament in 32:2. And I'm going to take you back to Ezekiel 18:23. One more time, maybe not the last. Do I have any pleasure in the death of the wicked, declares the Lord God, rather that he should turn from his evil ways and live. And so prior to that, there were several things. I'm just going to read them to you. He says to them in chapter 3, in 3 different places, he says, go speak to them whether they listen or not. Warn them from me. So this was God's heart. He wants the people to be warned. In this case, he's speaking about Israel, but he wants the world to be warned. It's what he's doing here with all these other nations. He's had plenty of warnings sent to them. How many warnings did Pharaoh have before Egypt had all the plagues dumped upon her head? Yeah? Then in chapter 5, in 3 different places, he says, I will execute judgments among Israel in the sight of the nations as a warning to them. So he's not only warning Israel, but he's really warning the nations. In the sight of the nations, God did these things to Israel. So that's where we are in history. Well, right here in history, he's saying about these nations that we've been studying these past few chapters, he's saying, I did to Israel, I did it in the sight of the nations so that the nations would be warned from me. That was God's intent. Lament over this, that they're falling, that they did not repent. Because do I not desire that they would rather turn from their wicked ways and live? So then he goes on in chapter 6, verse 7, saying about the slain will fall, and then they will know that I am the Lord. So he's talking about how he's raising up kingdoms, and he's putting kingdoms down, and he's doing it for the purpose that they will know who he is. It's a display of his power. It's a display of his sovereignty. And this is something that's supposed to turn them. This is how God worked Nebuchadnezzar's salvation through. By proclaiming 1 year beforehand, he brought it to fruition. He became a bovine in the fields. His fingernails grew and pinions and all these things were talked about in describing what he looked like in his state of madness. 7 periods of time went over him, and then he came to his senses, and he declared God as God Most High. That's what God wants for all these nations to do. Recognize, I gave you what I gave you. I made you big and beautiful nations. You didn't do that yourself. I permitted it. I ordained it. I gave it to you. And that's what God is showing us here. That's why he starts out this by saying, lament. And this whole thing, as you're reading it, it doesn't sound like a lament, but it's a lament. He's saying, lament over this. This is what's going to happen to these people who won't bow their knee to me. Is there a message in this for us? And in a way, it's rather frightening when you think of the people that you know that don't know the Lord, and it just breaks your heart knowing this is going to be their demise, what we are going to be looking at right here. Okay, so first of all, it starts out by telling us something about Pharaoh, what he did in order that God began to do these things. What did he do? There's an imagery given to you.
Compared yourself to a young lion.
Yes, that's what you think you are, but what does God think he is?
Yet you are like the monster in the sea.
Yeah. And he says, because you're the monster in the sea, you burst forth in your rivers, and what did you do? You muddied the waters. I love that. So muddying the waters, what is that speaking of?
When you muddy the waters, you're stirring it up.
Yes, you're stirring it up. And so what do you think that's picture-wise? What's he saying about Pharaoh in Egypt? What was he doing? When God was, for instance, in this timeline here, God has already decreed that Israel's going to go into their captivity. We're at 585, so we are 1 year or a few months anyway beyond, a couple of months beyond Israel having been sacked, right? We've seen a lot of these other things happen. So he says about Israel, this is what I've done to them. Do you think I will not do this to you? I do this to my own people. Will I not judge you also? And he says, you are muddying the waters. And what does he mean by that? Because what did they do? What did Egypt do?
They tried to change the plan. They stirred up.
Yeah.
Created chaos.
They created chaos. They stepped in and they tried to thwart God's plan, right? So they muddied the water means to stir up trouble, right? Fouled the waters. Did anybody look that up?
It was disturbed.
Okay, disturbing. Make unclear or not clear, and trampling. So when God is saying one thing to Israel, over here Egypt's saying, oh, just trust us. Come on, we'll help you out, right? And so causing trouble and muddying the waters, making things unclear. So Pharaoh had muddied the waters. He's supposed to be a good leader that takes care of everyone and is a good king who does the right things for his people. But instead he was power hungry. And then God says, thus, right? Well, thus what? Thus says the Lord in verse 3. So 3 to 6. What's God going to do to Egypt? He says, I will.
Take them out of the water.
Yeah, I'm going to take you out. You muddy those waters. I'm going to take. That's a good title, actually. I will take you out of the waters. And what does he say? Now I will what?
Cast you into the field.
Yeah, what in verse 3? He says, now I will spread my net over you. We've seen that before, right? In previous, with a company of many peoples. Who do you think those many peoples are? All kinds of different nations. Now, to me, when I look this up in the dictionary, it makes it sound like this could be both a short-term prophecy and a long-term prophecy. He could be speaking of Babylon being one of those nations, but later in history there could be other nations that will also come in and do these things to her. So I will spread my net over you with a company of many peoples, and they shall lift you up in my net, and I will leave you on the land. I will cast you on the open field. I will cause all the birds of the heaven to dwell on you. Boy, there's a picture of that about the vultures. It made me think of vultures, right? And I will satisfy the beasts of the whole earth with you. And I thought of predators, these predatory animal-like leaders. They're all looking, waiting and watching to pounce when their opportunity comes. And so when Egypt drops, they're going to pounce and they're going to take their position in the world. And I will lay your flesh on the mountains and fill the valleys with your refuse. I will also make the land drink the discharge of your blood. There again is that picture of physical death. As far as the mountains and the ravines will be full of you. So, now tell me what you said. I will, did you say remove you? What did you say on your title?
Take you out of the water.
There you go. I will take you out of the water. Okay? And he's going to do it with a company of many peoples. So he's talking about how this is a physical thing on the earth that's taking place. It's not going to be, it's not talking about an eternal damnation forever gone. He's talking about a physical nation that God is going to judge. They're going to die by the sword. Many of them are going to lay on the land. The birds of the air were going to eat on them. The animals of the earth are going to come and prey on them. And he's speaking about that God is going to take that nation down. Now, think of where we are in history today. Is Egypt gone? No. So what kind of a gone are we talking about? A little by little. And that's why I think he speaks of many peoples.
Yeah, because they're not all going to come at them all at once.
No.
It's going to be,
Right.
they're never going to have peace.
Did anybody go back and read Daniel 11, like I told you, 36 to the end? Did anybody do that? Because Daniel 36, in chapter 11 and 36 on, is about the end times, at the end of the age during this tribulation. And he says, my brain just lost what I was, my train of thought. Oh, right, the end time king. And he says, the king of the north and the king of the south are going to come against Israel and against the Antichrist. And the king of the south is going to get trampled, right? And the king of the south is who? Egypt. And where are they? In these days yet. So here we are back here still in the church age. Back here Ezekiel is talking about, he's saying, Egypt, you will be trampled by many nations. So this is going to go on through the generations, even into the tribulation. And then what's going to happen in the millennial kingdom is what Kay took us to read in Isaiah 19. Did you see the last half of Isaiah 19? Did you read that?
Yes.
What happens?
So in that day, Israel will be the third party with Egypt and Syria, a blessing in the midst of the earth.
Wow.
Yeah.
They are going to be humbled, and they are going to be a blessing. Assyria, Egypt, and Israel, all worshiping God in this day. Isn't that? So it's alluding to some stuff far, but it's also speaking of a present. Are you seeing how they're blending? And this is where it gets complicated with these kinds of books. But so you just have to know your eschatology, and you have to understand where things fit on a timeline. And if you do what we just did here and put it out on a sheet, you can at least in your head go, okay, so part of it's talking about down here, and some of it's talking about back here. Okay? And then you can kind of reconcile it.
The other part of this chapter is, and the Lord will strike Egypt, striking, but healing, so they will return to the Lord.
And then he's going to strike them first and then heal them. And that striking is going to take place during this. And that's what you see in Ezekiel 11. The king of the north and the south and how they come. There's all this fighting. The Antichrist, you remember here, he sets up himself in the temple. Then the bowls of wrath get poured out in that last 3.5 years. Then Jesus comes. So he's purging right here. He says about Israel, this time right here, this is the 70th week of Daniel. It's for the purpose of Daniel's people and his holy city. That's what the purpose of that last 1 week is, which is 7 years. And at the end of it, God is going to bring in salvation, but he's going to do it by purging first. 2/3 are going to fall of Israel, are going to fall by the sword. Well, what do you think about the rest of the world? There's going to be a lot, probably even more. I don't know. But, I mean, it doesn't tell us how much of the earth dies.
Yes.
But we do know that at the end of the age, in Matthew 24 and 25, I think it must be in 25, he speaks about when Jesus begins to set up his reign here, he says he brings the sheep and the goats before him. He separates the sheep from the goats. And that's where I was going to try to talk to you about the nations and what that all is talking about there. So if I get a chance, I'll go back to that. Okay, so let's finish this up. I will take you out of the water with a company of many people. So some of it's short term, some of it's long term.
Something about 40 years he would bring them back and let them experience.
Yeah, in that present time, yes. He did say that. He said Egypt, was it Egypt or?
No, it was Egypt.
It was Egypt. Okay, yes.
Be off the land and then
And then bring them back.
The lowest of
Right.
the
And that's the part where we said we don't have historical records on all that. They argue as to whether or not it really happened. And my speech to you last week was retain the standard of sound doctrine. If you can't find it in your history records anywhere, and all the commentaries and all the theologians and all the historians disagree, who's right? God is. The standard remains your standard. Okay. So, but yes, correct. Okay. What do we got in 7 to 10? There's a win in there. What is he going to do in 7 to 10? Whoa, extinguish. Now that's really interesting. Extinguish is a lot more strong in that statement there, right? When he speaks of, let's see, hold on, 30, oh, I'm wrong one, 32, 77. And he says, when I extinguish you, then he describes the day. Did you notice? How is it described?
Sounds like end time.
It sure sounds like end times to me too. It says, I will cover the heavens with darkness and will darken their stars, cover the sun with a cloud. The moon will not give its light. When does that all happen? Right in here, in the tribulation. Okay, that's when these things of the heavens begin to happen. All the shining lights in the heavens will darken over you. I will set darkness on your land, declares the Lord. I will also trouble the hearts of many peoples when I bring your destruction among the nations. So it sounds like he makes a switcheroo there. He talks about something that's going to happen far-reaching, and then he switches back to something that's going to happen in their day. Now, I am not certain that God didn't do this, at least in part, in that day, where there may have been some kind of an eclipse or something happened in the day when Egypt fell, that God gave as a sign in the heavens. That would be a day of the Lord if it happened. We don't have record of it. We don't know. But God says, I'm going to extinguish you and cover the heavens with darkness. So to me, what does God almost always do when he's going to do something really profound at some point? There's some kind of a sign, and there's a foreshadow, right? Just like Antiochus Epiphanes is a foreshadow of Antichrist and what he did by the abomination of desolation. It's going to happen again at the end of the age when the Antichrist comes and commits an abomination. So here what we see, speaking to Egypt, he says about how the heavens are going to become darkened. And then he says, and also the hearts of the people are going to be trembling. Now, I remember many verses in Revelation that talks about the hearts of people trembling and being fearful and say, let the rocks fall on us and hide us from the presence of the Lord. So that's all very reminiscent of what you see going on in Revelation 17 and 18 also when we get into the next part on Babylon. But so he also says about that the hearts of many peoples, when I bring your destruction among the nations into lands which you have not known. Now, what is that talking about? Well, if it's not known to them, what does that mean? Why wouldn't it be known to them?
Back then, because these places didn't exist yet.
Yeah, there you go. How about because it's something future? America didn't exist back then, for instance, right? So not it possibly speaking of that. I mean, it may have other implications. We're not certain. You can let your thoughts kind of travel, and you can certainly do commentary work and see what other people say. But let me just reassure your hearts. Unless they can definitively lay a document down that absolutely declares it happened, like a cuneiform finding or ancient history records, even some of those ancient history records like Josephus and others, they argued with one another. They weren't always in agreement. So you just have to know that whatever it is that he means here is what he did. But he's saying that this destruction and the troubling of the hearts of many peoples, when I bring your Egypt, I bring you destruction among the nations and into lands which you have not yet known. So they're going to hear about this in other lands. I will make many peoples appalled at you, and their kings will be horribly afraid of you. When I banish my sword before them, They will tremble every moment, every man for his own life on the day of your fall. Now, on the day sounds like a little allusion to the day of the Lord, possibly. I marked it like that. It could mean both. It could be on the day of Egypt, and it could be on also the day of the Lord. We know both are true. Okay? So you don't have to declare it's only one. It can mean both. All right? Now you know I don't want to do Isaiah. Okay. All right. So he says about this then, he makes a reference to a time when I extinguish. When I extinguish you, Egypt. I'm gonna put Egypt in there instead of you. When I extinguish Egypt. He says about the lights, what? Lights of heaven will what? Mm-hmm. They'll be darkened. And the hearts of peoples troubled or appalled. So that kind of gives you an illusion, I think, possibly. I'm going to say mostly it sounds like it's alluding to the end times, right? Here, this is talking when I take you, Egypt. That sounds like present day. This sounds more like future, mostly, in 7 to 10. We saw this pattern in the previous chapter, though, so this is not unusual to us. 11 to 16, then, goes back to where? Speaks about what nation? About Babylon. So now we're definitely talking about that present day, well, I shouldn't say definitely, possibly. And what's Babylon going to do in 11? He will come upon you. Babylon will come upon you. And he says then he switches from Babylon and he takes personal possession of what's going on, right? Did you notice the I wills in here? And so in other words, through Babylon, God is going to say, I will do what? Yeah. I will, okay, sounds like warts or something, doesn't it? What verse are you in?
The mighty ones are the Babylonians.
Yeah, by the swords of the mighty ones are the Babylonians. I will cause your hordes to fall. All of them are tyrants of the nations. So his hordes are these other tyrants of the nations. So he's going to say, I will smite all Egypt and her hordes, basically, right? Or make them fall, however you want to say it.
And I looked that word hordes up, and it can also imply wealth, riches, abundance.
Yeah, but in this context, what is it talking about?
It's about the multitude.
It's about multitudes of nations.
But it also is about their wealth.
It can, yes, because they're going to plunder their wealth, of course, right. But by definition, when you see that word hordes, think of nations, okay? Power nations of some kind, too. They weren't just Bedouins. These are the nations that can come in and help her. And then he says, and this is where I finished it, where you took this, I will take you out of the waters. I concluded on here, in this one about the waters, what is he going to do with them?
Make the water settle and cause the river to run like oil.
Yeah.
Not good.
Well, no, it depends on what is being meant there. Now, again, are we speaking short term or long term? Short term, when he says, I'm going to settle those waters, if it's a contrast to what he's done before, he's saying, you muddied the waters. You got in there and stirred up all this trouble. I'm going to calm that down by doing what? Smiting you. And then that water's going to become smooth, like oil. In other words, it's going to flow gently again. So there's that picture. But if you take it maybe to the end times and talk about it from that perspective, the idea of waters looking like oil made me think of how God says that a third of the rivers are going to turn to blood and a third of the seas and the fish are going to die and all these horrible things. Talking about it becoming sluggish and murky with blood, like oil. But certainly we can see the contrast to what he's saying about muddying waters versus calming the waters here, right? Okay, so that's the first part of it. That covers this section right here. And I'll just put a box around it in green. That's talking about that part. Now we're going to cover the next part where we're going to talk about things that have to do with Sheol and the end times, and the eternal part of it, the perspective of eternal salvation. Okay? So now he says, Egypt and all her hordes will go down to Sheol. I'm not going to put the title back up, but that's the title that we're at here. Now we're in 17 to 21. We got just a couple of minutes. We got to do it quick. But I think we can do it really quick because this is really cool. We've discussed Sheol. We don't really need to go more. Now, the cool thing is I did get a really good list, and you can do it too. Did you all make a simple list on your observation worksheet on all the different terms or names for Sheol? Did you make do it? Make an accumulation list on the side, just titled it Sheol, and then list all the ways Sheol is described in this chapter. Tell me what they are right now so that we can just, in our heads, do this.
Grave.
Okay, what verse are you in?
23.
Okay, in verse 23, the grave.
Pits in 23.
Okay, also the pit. Go back up to 18.
Bed of the uncircumcised.
Oh yeah, the bed of the uncircumcised. That's a really good one. The netherworld. Yes, very good. I think, what about verse 24? The lower parts of the earth. Okay. So, if I missed any, just know that. But my whole page is covered with these. When it talks about the pit, it says going down to it, right? So you might even want to put that in there. So 17 to 21 then starts about that place called Sheol, talking about Egypt and who else? And daughters of her hordes, or you could say and her hordes, or in this case it opens in 21. It says and what does it say about the daughters? 18. Her and the daughters of the powerful nations. So in other words, this would be the children of, in other words, it would be other nations, the daughters, okay? I just used their words, the daughters of powerful nations. Or you could just say Egypt and other powerful nations. Because is that what's going to be talked about as after you leave verse 21 and 22? Yeah. So then he goes on in 22 and 23. Who does he talk about? What nation?
Syria.
When you get to 24 and 25, what does he talk about? Elam and all her hordes. Okay, 26 and 28 to 28. Okay. Meshach and Tubal and all her hordes. Then you get to 29. Edom. Is that me? Who's ringing? Is that me?
It's not me.
Okay, good. If it's not me, then that's okay. I thought I had mine off. Okay. Now we're in 30. Mm-hmm. Chiefs of North and the Sidonians. Okay. And then we conclude in 31 to 32 about Pharaoh again. That takes us back in history, right? I want to mark it in green. because it goes back in history again. And he says, Pharaoh will what? What a jerk. He's going to be comforted when he sees what?
His hordes slain by the sword.
And concerning him, what's going to happen with him? What's he going to be made to do?
Lie down with the uncircumcised.
Yeah, he will be made to lie down with the uncircumcised. Now, I did that really quickly. And listen, all of these, you can have a secondary piece to it like this one. With Syria, it says in the remotest parts of the pits is where she will be. Elam and all her hordes, they went down uncircumcised to the lower parts of the earth. Mishal and Tubal and all their hordes, punishments rested on their bones, and their graves surround them. That's a time when I do think the word graves is speaking of Sheol. Edom, his king and princesses, they will go down to the pit. The chiefs of the north and the Sidonians, they go down to the pit, and then Pharaoh will be made to lie down among the uncircumcised. And you see a use of all that language. So it's just a repetitive thing. What is God showing us there? A lot of things that you can learn about God's character right here. What are you seeing?
They got their just reward.
They did get their they will, if they in fact are the uncircumcised. If they refuse to bow their knee to God Most High in that day, in our day, if you refuse to accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, you will go down to the pit, to the grave, to Sheol, to the netherworld. This is scary. If you are not in a place of relationship with God, you are the uncircumcised. In the New Testament, what gets circumcised with us? Is it the flesh? No, it's the heart by the Spirit. Circumcision is of the heart by the Spirit. You must be circumcised by God, or you will go down to the pit. Okay, we did that. That was awesome. I have so much more I could teach. I mean, I have a lot more I could teach, but it was lovely. I'm excited. We'll have a couple of weeks off, right? 2 weeks off in a row. And we'll be back to begin Ezekiel part 2. And I would highly recommend you do some research on the day of the Lord and on Sheol and whatever other questions you might have in the meantime. Use your time wisely if you can. Go ahead and work ahead if you want. If you feel that you want to do that, it will be helpful to get some of your markings done ahead, because we know how much homework each of these chapters have. Even if you just go in on each of the chapters in part 2 and mark God and some of the nations, that kind of stuff, without going into the detail of it, it'll familiarize yourself with what's going to happen at the rest of this, and it'll help you grab hold of your major subjects, at least off the top at the beginning. And it would be awesome if you read all the way to the end of Ezekiel at this point to see where we're headed, because it'll help your mind wrap around where we're at in all of this. All right.
All this pride and this haughtiness of all these nations reminds me of our people in government.
Yes.
Governmental positions.
This is,
today
yes, it does.
and others.
And does it not lend you to say, when a nation becomes so arrogant that they, first of all, that they don't acknowledge God Most High, which is what we see going on in our government in a lot of these people. Not everyone. There are many good leaders who love the Lord, but there are a lot that do not. But there are much more dominant that are not. And certainly it does not seem like from the top down right now we are getting any kind of leadership that's godly. So yes. And so what's going to happen if we don't U-turn it? If we don't turn this around, our nation will have to suffer these kinds of consequences, I think.
And all these other nations that are battling one another now.
It also makes you kind of explain the idea of, how often have you had people say, well, where's America in the end of the age? We've been such a powerhouse in the world for so many years of our understanding. Well, maybe we won't even last as long as Egypt or Assyria or any of these others did, because we are not being faithful with what God has entrusted to us. And it seems like,
Acknowledging where he put us.
yes, not acknowledging him, not bowing our knee, not seeking him, not giving him the credit and the glory for the beauty of this nation that we have. The Constitution that we have is a precious thing and should be protected. And we're not doing that as a nation. We're acting as if it doesn't matter. And, yeah, sad. Okay, thank you guys. Love you. See you all in a couple of weeks.